When Papa returned home an hour after Teague and Annalee, he offered to go upstairs and talk with the boy. Annalee convinced him to wait for morning so Teague could grieve to himself, and so the rest of the night passed fitfully for all concerned. When Annalee saw that it was finally light enough outside to justify rising, she dressed in the black-dyed frock she'd worn the previous day and headed for Teague's room. She stepped around the corner of the door-frame and saw that Papa had beaten her to it. She started to turn back on her tiptoes, but was startled by Papa's breathless voice. "Annalee, fetch my bag," he called, and she now noticed what had not registered in her initial momentary glance. Papa knelt on the side of the bed, shaking Teague, even slapping his face, but with no response. "John!" Annalee heard Papa yell, as she took the stairs 2 at a time, and she returned with the bag at the same moment John reached the door. Papa motioned him near the bed. "Sit him up. Annalee, smelling salts." She rifled the bag while John and Papa struggled to lift Teague by his limp arms and brace his back against the headboard. They held him there until Annalee uncorked the bottle and, holding it well away from herself, joined them on the bed. Teague grimaced and turned his head away from the salts when she held them to his nose, but still he didn't open his eyes. "Keep at him," Papa instructed. So Annalee followed his turning head with the bottle as best she could until Teague let out an exasperated breath and opened his eyes enough to glare at her. Papa took the bag. "Teague, I need you to swallow something for me. Can you swallow?" Teague grunted what sounded like a negative reply, but Papa pulled out a bottle of Ipecac anyway. John stopped his hand. "He's barely conscious. Vomit will strangle him." "If we don't empty his stomach, strangling will be the least of his problems." Papa turned up the bottle at Teague's mouth, but he wouldn't swallow. The fluid ran out of the corner of his mouth, and his eyes managed a look of defiance. Papa sat back to think for a moment. "All right, turn him over. Annalee, wash basin." John leaned with Teague until both of their heads extended beyond the side of the bed. Then Papa held the basin under them with one hand, and forced his index finger into Teague's mouth and toward the back of his throat. It took a moment for Teague to gag hard enough to force up the contents of his stomach, but when the vomit did come, it spilled over Papa's hand and splattered into the basin. Teague tried to sit up to get away from the smell of it, but John's weight held him down. Papa's finger penetrated his closed lips again and again, his arm and body heaving in gruesome syncopation with Teague's paroxysms of vomiting, until the basin was full, and Annalee could see some of the undigested grains of opium floating in the bile. Papa and John moved back from Teague, both sweating from exertion, but Teague lay trembling in his prone position, his face pallid except for purple strain blotches around his eyes, which were staring blankly at the wall. "I'll empty this," Papa told John as he stood with the basin. "Give him a dose of calomel to purge the rest of it." And then, after Teague closed his eyes, he said, "Don't let him sleep yet." Together, Annalee and John set Teague back against the headboard, and while John poured out the appointed dosage, Annalee kept the smelling salts near enough to Teague's nose to make it impossible for him to doze again. He didn't fight the treatment as he had only a few minutes before, but sat with no volition whatsoever. Not even when the calomel took effect did he move to the chamber pot, choosing instead to let the watery bowel movement spread through his clothing and into the bed linens. And as she stood outside the room waiting for Papa and John to clean him up, Annalee imagined that he gave as little cooperation as he could in the matter. When Papa finally emerged with the soiled materials bundled in a blanket, he glanced at the hall clock. It was nearly noon. "Tell your mother and Mrs. Dow not to set any lunch. I think I speak for all when I say I'm not hungry." "Is he all right?" Papa sighed and started down the hall. "He's sleeping now, so all we can do is watch and wait and hope he doesn't stop breathing. In any event, I'm taking all the opium and laudanum out of this house, save a vial under lock and key in my desk. He's not to have so much as a half a grain unless I can't see any way around it." He stopped and looked back toward Teague's room. "I've never seen this done, not even read about it, but I have heard a story or two. He will not be happy when he wakes. John and I will have to watch him constantly." "I want to help." Papa barely hesitated before answering. "We'll make 3 shifts, then. While he's sleeping, check his wardrobe and drawers for any other stockpiles. He overdosed on a vial he must have bought privately. He won't do that again. And I need you to take all the sharp objects and glass from his room, from the mirror down to his pencils and spectacles. It will be a hellish several days for him." By the time Annalie's watch came near midnight, the effects of the opium remaining in Teague's system had begun to wear off. Papa and John had moved in extra chairs so that they could sleep and still be in the room with her. Papa rose from the seat directly beside the bed and motioned for her to step quietly to him to avoid waking John or Teague. "His breathing is fine, so I think that worry is behind us. Now we'll just see what happens," Papa whispered. "Let me know if he wakes. He'll likely call for his pill case, but he is not to have it, no matter what he says to convince you." She nodded and sat down beside Teague while Papa sat across the room and pulled a blanket over himself. He watched with her for about an hour before he, too, dozed. A draught of chill air threatened the flame on the bedside candle. Annalie followed the draught to its source at the window and stuffed a few rags from Teague's bureau into the crevices. She tried to look through the darkened glass and saw only her reflection there, but she could hear the tapping of the hardened rain and snow. Her prediction from the moon's ring held true. It was as if in this last month heaven had reneged on the promise to never destroy the earth with water, but had chosen the wrong season in which to do it. Instead of rushing floods, smothering snows blotted out the world, and entombing ice cracked and shattered and sounded like it could split the sky and land and everything in them. She wondered if the weather was better at Teague's home, if they could look out their windows and see a mercifully clear sky and bless God for taking their side. Or perhaps they, too, were consumed by ice as an indication that both sides were damned. Teague started to stir in the bed. He kicked at the cover with his left leg and turned from one side to the other until the blankets were completely pushed to the edge of the bed and his nightshirt was up around his thighs, exposing the flesh of his stump. Annalie stared at that skin with its smoothness, like that of a tiny patch of new skin on her hand that grew after she burned herself on the edge of a frying pan. The scar ran across the end like the grotesque smile of an old man without teeth, the upper lip protruding slightly over the lower lip, but both tucked in. The pinpricks where the flaps had been sewn were still visible above and below the line. She reached to touch the scar, hesitated, looked to Teague's face, and then traced her fingers along the groove. It was not chilling like she had expected. The skin was warm, comforting even. It was a part of Teague, of who he was, and with the sheer physicality of this skin she was touching, skin that had been broken and healed yet was so incomplete, she was brought as close to truly knowing another person as is possible without sharing a soul. She thought of the Godhead, that enigma of 3 beings as one God that she could never quite get her mind around, and for a moment understood the concept, though she would never be able to articulate it. "God help him," she prayed, before Teague moved again. She pulled back her hand and replaced the covers. Sweat stuck his hair to his cheek when he turned on his side, and the pillow was damp where his head had been. Annalie wiped his face with a handkerchief and felt his fever through the cloth. The handkerchief was better than a sponge she would have to leave the room to find, so she dipped it in a basin full of water and began bathing his face. The lines in his forehead smoothed a bit as she ran the cool cloth over it and down his cheeks, but when she moved to his neck, his hand caught hers, and he stared at her with a moment's confusion. He loosened his grip, but kept his eyes on her. "I hurt all over," he said hoarsely. Annalie offered him a cup of water, so he pushed himself into a seated position. "Bring my pill case," he demanded after a sip. "Papa has your medicine locked away in his desk, and he won't tell anybody where the key is." Teague's fear was palpable as he looked to Papa asleep across the room, but he wiped his nose and covered the fear with bravado. Old man stands by his word. He glanced to Annalee. I'm sick. I need it. I can't. It really does hurt, he pleaded. She watched his hands wring each other as though they were cold, and then they moved to press his eyes shut with their palms. How could you do it? She asked after a moment. He didn't move his hands away from his eyes, nor make any indication that he meant to answer her. So Annalee woke her father, who stood up and appraised Teague for a long time before finally addressing him. Can you take something to eat? Teague shook his head and pressed harder on his eyes. I suppose you know that I intend to break this habit, Papa said. But it's not a punishment as you may think. I've had the impression for some time now that your reliance on the drug has become more of a burden to you than a help. Is that not so? Teague took a shaky breath. My head hurts. My arms hurt. My innards are less than stable. The treatment for these ailments, doctor, is in your desk. That is what is so. Papa answered the complaint by sitting again. The purgation, I'm afraid, I'll continue, as it clears your system. Drink whatever water you want to stay hydrated. That's of the utmost importance. For your head, we can apply cool compresses. Teague flopped back down in bed like a sulking child, and when Annalee dipped her handkerchief in the basin and moved to place it, he yanked the cover up and held it around his head. He did not emerge during the rest of her shift.